Thanks, Patrick.
Hello, welcome back. I am Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor at Defense One. Our next panel is Titans of Technology, Winning the Future of Defense. Joining me is Emmanuel Bresson, Advisor for Cyber AI and Disruptive Technologies within the French Ministry of Armies, in the Directorate General for International Relations and Strategy, and Dr. Heather Roff, Senior Research Analyst at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. Welcome to you both. Quick reminder to our audience, we do want to hear from you. We're very anxious to incorporate your questions into our programming today. Use the GLOBSEC app to send us questions, and I'll be able to see them here. Later on, I might ask the room if they have questions. Please raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, and then you can approach the microphone. Please keep that in mind. We do want to hear from you. Okay, 1 second. Emmanuel, can you hear me okay? Let Emmanuel fix his sound problem real quick. Let me turn instead to you, Heather, real quick. How can the international community strengthen the regulatory framework when it comes to the ethical use of AI in theater operations?
Thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm very honored to be asked to be here today. And I just want to let you know that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. So these are personal opinions. They do not represent Johns Hopkins or the Department of Defense or anybody else, or Brookings or anybody else. I think one of the big things about strengthening ethical implications around AI in theater operations, even when tactical operations, joint operations, any operations generally, is that we have to start with the technology, and we have to start with warfighter-centered design. So when we're thinking about how to best research, design, develop, deploy, we have to think about what the exact technology is going to be used for, and then uphold certain types of principles. So the U.S. Department of Defense, for example, has adopted a set of 5 ethical principles: governable, responsible, equitable. There's a variety of things that are in that, and a lot of that have to do with designing for traceability and auditability, ensuring that warfighters are centered to design and deployment, and that human responsibility is at the core of all operations. And so I think when we're thinking about how we deploy AI within defensive operations, we have to think about what the AI is intended to do. Is it a decision aid? Is it an ISR application? Is it a strike application? Do we have the right kind of data? Is the data properly curated? Do we have appropriate testing, evaluation, verification, validation regimes in place to ensure that those systems are working as intended? Do we have some way to observe those applications as they're deployed to ensure that they are working within the boundaries of intended use, and that they are not learning behaviors outside of those that intended use scope? Do we have some measure of auditability? How do we train and equip officers and operators to continually understand those systems? How do we certify and license autonomous technologies to ensure that their lifetime use is in accordance with what we want them to do, and that they are not learning unintended behaviors outside of that. So this is a very big endeavor that really spans doctrine, organization, training, logistics, design, development. This is a huge endeavor that I think all militaries really have to take into consideration, from everything from policy to how many maintainers you need for a given platform, and what types of training those individuals need, how you train lawyers and judge advocate generals to ensure that they are making appropriate proportionality calculations and understanding the implications of using particular assets in the use of armed force. This is not a one-shot problem. This is a huge problem that all militaries are ultimately going to have to spend a great deal of time thinking through.
So in covering this space, one thing that's been very clear to me and to a lot of other people that are watching the effects of emerging technology on military technology is the accelerating effects of things like machine learning and big data on the pace of operations, potentially on the pace of warfare. And that seems to put a lot of potential future stress on commanders and others to make decisions ever faster with an ever shrinking observe, orient, decide, and act, or OODA loop cycle. So having an AI principles list at the Department of Defense is a huge accomplishment. It's, I think, something that international allies are very excited to see. But is that sufficient to your mind to deal with the threat posed by accelerated operations due to the advent of new technologies like machine learning? Is having a principles list enough to offset the potential harm there?
Well, no, you can't just have a principles list and say job done, right? What really matters is the application and the institutionalization of those principles. The Joint AI Center within the DoD right now is working very hard on figuring out the ways in which they are instituting those principles. Again, like, so going back to testing and evaluation, for example, like, what does that look like? You know, we don't have a very robust testing regime for machine learning systems, right? We can't exhaustively test the space of machine learning. We can do simulations, we can try to find edge cases, but in reality, we can't fully test these systems like we have tested previous legacy systems. And so there's a fundamental shift there. But I think, you know, even with the speeding up of operations, there is an inherent limit, right? I mean, we are talking about, I mean, cyber is one thing. We can talk about cyber and how that is a bit of a different space. But when it comes to physical operations, right, we are still limited by time, space, logistics. You know, how many warships do I have in an area? How many planes do I need to complete a mission? What does my resupply line look like? How do I do joint operations with NATO, right? How do I do my comms lines? How do I divide airspace? There are limits to operations given the physical constraints of warfare. But we do have a huge amount of data that's coming in. We are pretty much observed all the time. I mean, when we think about space assets and ISR, there's just, you know, your adversary can see you all the time and what you're doing and what movements you're planning. And so that becomes its own challenge. But what I would say is that, you know, the OODA loop is speeding up, but it can only speed up on the quality of data. Just because you have data doesn't mean that it's useful. It has to be curated. It has to be appropriate for the mission. It has to be representative of your adversary's intentions or beliefs or assets. And when we're in warfare, you know, your adversary is not going to tell you exactly what they're going to do. They have incentives to dissemble. They have incentives to use ruses. And so the data that we're getting is not clean. It is not perfect. And even with massive amounts of it, there's a lot of noise in that data.
Let me turn to you, Emmanuel. Thank you for joining us. The same question. On the one hand, we know that artificial intelligence and emerging technologies are going to be a force multiplier. They're going to allow militaries to have much greater effect with fewer assets. At the same time, they also contribute to an accelerating pace of operations, which can be very difficult for commanders, particularly commanders that live and operate in societies where there's a strong sense of government accountability, command and control, and where individual officers are held accountable for their actions as opposed to other types of government. So can you describe a little bit of that friction from your perspective, from a military perspective? How, on the one hand, do you use technology like AI to be a force multiplier, to have as maximal effect on the battlefield as possible, while at the same time allowing commanders to deal with the accelerated pace of operations?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Within the Ministry of Defense, we have identified a number of fields where the embedding of artificial intelligence can help in this multiplying effect that you just described. Whatever it's on the battlefield, whatever it's in the cyberspace for intelligence, information, whatever it's on the materials for logistics, maintenance, or on the medical for rescue, evacuation, and so on. And of course, don't forget the I should say the masterpiece of all these fields, which is the actions of planifications, decision makings, and situation awareness. In all these domains, the artificial intelligence is a factor of acceleration, multiplication of efficiency, and improvement of the precision. Meaning with this, taking better decision, taking more precise decision, or at the better moment, or calibrating more appropriately the resources and the materials you need on the field. Of course, embedding such algorithms and artificial intelligence and data everywhere can lead to increased complexity for the commandment. This is also one of the reasons for which we have identified as a critical as a criteria of critical importance to remain within a rigorous chain of commands when performing the operations, and in particular the question of maintaining at every moment and at every level a sufficient human control on all these operations.
Excellent. Let's go to Zoom and take a question from Jim Townsend in the United States.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Townsend. Just a sound check. Can you hear me?
We hear you, Jim.
Good.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I found both of those presentations absolutely fascinating. My background is I've spent about 35 years working NATO and Europe at the Pentagon. So I'm not a technical guy, but you've got to keep track with technology, particularly dealing with NATO, to make sure there's interoperability. And that's my question for both of you. NATO yesterday, the heads of state and government agreed to establish an innovation accelerator, which is a great name, because they're concerned, the alliance, that that NATO allies keep on top of the technology changes. And I know some allies are. But what does this mean for you? How do you coordinate with NATO yourselves? DOD, I mean, I worked in the Pentagon for many years. There is some coordination with NATO through the regional offices there and a little bit on the acquisition side. But on the tech side, with this this new innovation, there's also a fund that NATO is going to put towards R&D and tech. how are you going to negotiate? How are you going to interoperate and to communicate and to coordinate with what NATO is doing as an institution, and what NATO allies are going to be doing individually, or are we going to be doing things in stovepipes? Thanks.
I'll take that to you, Emmanuel, first. Oh, and then Heather.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. This is a very interesting question. How should allies coordinate with between them and at the alliance level to incorporate and to take the best advantage of such technologies? So first of all, I should say that the most important thing is to understand ourselves mutually on what we're talking about. It looks like basics, but in case of usage, responsible use of artificial intelligence, and especially in the defense sector, in the military domain, this is extremely important, because we know that the limits are not easy to define and to I would say to translate into concrete actions, programs, and developments. Also about the developments and the military program, one of the question I think is still to be on the table is that these technologies, whatever we talk about AI in itself or other disruptive technologies, the point is that these technologies are inherently dual civil and military, which means that we have to decide between a member of the alliance what will be to be led by the alliance, either the military alliance, and what has to be developed and under the responsibility of states. I think this is important, especially when we talk about making use of these technologies in a military context, in a context of potential conflicts, when we have a common reference, which is the application of the existing international humanitarian law, for which we have to think, of course, on how concretely and by which means the IHL can apply to the military use of these technologies.
Heather, you.
Yeah, Jim, thank you. That was a wonderful question. I think there's multiple ways in which NATO and the alliances, and not just NATO, I think even for the US case and DoD, the Five Eyes, I think there's a lot of things that need to be worked out. And one of the I think most pressing things, and one of the most big elephants in the room, is that, you know, even though that we're going to start using AI in different types of applications, and different militaries are going to use different types of systems because of their national defense posture. So we can think of, you know, Britain might be leaning more into naval operations. The US might be trying to do more AI and autonomy applications at the get-go within the Air Force. And so there's going to be variation between the member states about what types of applications that they're going to pursue and then develop and then deploy within their own militaries. But we are also always hamstrung by our networks and our communications. And so, you know, until we can figure out a better way to do those types of networks and communications and interoperability between members, and train, we have to train with our members. These are going to, the legacy systems are going to always hamstring the new systems, right? We are not going to kind of overturn the apple cart and say everything's new. Everything's not new. We're going to still have Link 16. We're still going to have different types of communication systems that we have to work with. We're still going to have to divide airspace in such a way. So, you know, my Patriot battery is going to be over here, and, you know, your missile defense system is going to be over there. And so I think we have to continually think about how we train and we equip our fighters now, and then how we feather in these new types of systems into our existing force postures, and then what types of missions that they're going to be appropriate for. And to Emmanuel's points, yes, IHL is an overriding concern, right? We are not going to field systems that are indiscriminate, that do not comply with the laws of armed conflict. But how we prove that they are discriminate, how we prove that we have sufficiently tested them, is going to start to shift and going to start to change because of the way in which these systems operate. They're fundamentally different. So I think as we are rolling out new applications and new platforms that utilize AI, we're going to not just see these as machine learning systems that, are just learning all the time. No, we're going to put systems that have a hybrid architecture out, that have different types of governors on them, that are not machine learning all the way down, right? That are going to have expert-based systems that we can fully test and validate. That ground collision avoidance systems. They're going to have geofencing. There's just going to be a different kind of stepwise approach to how we feather those in, and the allies within NATO are going to have to just be much more robust and transparent about what those systems are able to do and how they've tested them and their communications networks and how they train with them. It's just going to be even harder for allies to do that going forward, because it's not the same old technology that I can say this bomb is going to explode in this location at this time every single time I drop it. It's a behavioral shift.
More technologies, more challenges in that interoperability space for allies. Very important point. New question coming in from Zoom from Mauricio Mechulan from Mexico. Mauricio.
Hello, great to be here, and very, very interesting discussion from Mexico. Let me ask you this. We have been hearing from these issues since long ago. We have been reflecting on the ethics of artificial intelligence since I remember. However, we are subject to artificial intelligence mechanisms when we use our cell phones or our computers every day just to get profit from different companies. So how serious is this reflection when we speak about national interest, when we speak about enemies, when we speak about interests and agendas? How should we approach this in war scenarios that are happening in the world every day? What would be your approach to this?
Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very important question in the sense that we are talking about especially what we should do or not do, and what our potential adversaries would allow to themselves to do. Our goal is to stay within a strong ethics in our actions and in our use of these technologies. So basically, we want to maintain a core of a fundamental principle. I talked previously about the respect of the international humanitarian law, the respect of the chain of command, and the fact of having a sufficient human control at every level and at every moment. Giving this principle, we have to build on we have to do some, I would say, some doctrinal exercises to understand how we should respond and how we should behave if at some point we would be facing an enemy that would not respect the law and the principle like the same as we do. What do we want to do for our soldiers? We want to protect them in their actions, but at the same time, we want to remain exemplary in the way that we are performing our operation. So this is a reflection which is very important to incorporate from the very beginning in our development, in our programs, and in our operations. Very to simplify this, the ethic of our behavior is to be taken into account at every step since the beginning, in order to be as performant as we can, but staying within the limit that we have defined previously.
Sorry to cut you off, Emmanuel. I didn't mean to. Heather, did you have a thought on this?
Yeah, so, I was involved with the creation of the DoD's AI ethics principles. I was the special governmental expert attached to the Defense Innovation Board, writing those principles. And so, that was a very long exercise. And what I can say is that, to Emmanuel's point, there is a long history of attempting to have a professional code of ethics, of how to fight within the bounds of armed conflict. And most modern Western militaries take that professional code very, very seriously. And so where it changes with AI, I think, is we have to think about what's different, right? Like this is, how are we going to fight differently, and how are we going to uphold those same ethical codes of, command and control, of upholding LOAC, of upholding principles of distinction and necessity and proportionality. We have to think about how we design and develop and test and train. And these are all very big questions, and they're not easy problems to solve. This means that all of the militaries going forward have to take this as a serious commitment. You're not just acquiring a new piece of kit and then disseminating it throughout the force and everything's going to be fine. This is the way in which you interact with systems that learn, the way that you interact with systems that behaviors might be slightly unpredictable within a set of bounds. You have to equip commanders and operators with the appropriate knowledge and how to use that, when to make the appropriate judgments of when to use that type of kit. If I'm looking at a loitering munition, or I'm looking at a sub-hunter, or I'm looking at a swarm, all of these things are going to be based in a very big set of human judgments, with intelligence reports coming in, with satellite imagery, dual authentication of all sorts of things. And so humans have to deal with an increasingly complex space and make the appropriate judgments in line with their moral sets of values. But I do think that, having been part of that process of enumerating what those principles are, the militaries are very much committed to doing that. And even if our adversary says, I don't want to play by these rules, that's what sets us apart as modern militaries who do comply with a set of normative values in international humanitarian law. If we throw out those principles, then we have no moral standing on the international stage, and civilians will ultimately suffer. Not just our warfighters, but civilians will suffer. And so it's very important to maintain that set of values, to minimize force, and to protect human life as much as possible if we have to start using force.
I think it's a vital point, and if you aren't familiar with the AI ethics principles, I encourage you to check them out, because in many ways they are a blueprint for the way very large corporations should be constructing AI principles. The military's AI principles in the United States runs several pages, dozens of pages, as opposed to some that you see coming out of Silicon Valley that are maybe 800 words. So it's a real feat. But we have time for maybe one last question, and so I'll turn it to you, Heather. And if you want to chime in, Emmanuel, go ahead. But watching this space over the years, there's lots of different ways to invest in artificial intelligence. You can invest in new startups that are developing new algorithms. You can invest in more data sets and cloud to host that data. You can invest in more testing and experimentation to help reveal new plateaus of human-machine teaming. So to your mind, where is a military's research money best spent right now? Is it in testing? Is it in procuring new flashy solutions out of Silicon Valley? Is it in perhaps cloud hosting and creating that technical basis for interoperability that was just discussed. Where does a military invest now to best harness this future? I'll turn to you, Heather, first.
That's a great question, Pat. Because everybody, it's a zero-sum game, right? We only have so much money. So where do we put that money? Infrastructure is really the key, and depending upon a state's national interests and where they are going to pursue AI, given those national interests, I think infrastructure is key. So that's going to be in how do I create, maybe it's cloud, right? How do I best secure cloud computing storage and do so effectively? How do I upgrade my networks? How do I get more bandwidth? How do I make data easy to be interoperable and accessible across a force, to repurpose and to relabel? How do I then create that testing, verification, validation pipeline so that I can do software as a service instead of having to do acquisitions in a very old way of 30-year cycles and upgrades and someone walking around with a thumb drive and going to each computer? So I think really the backbone of any force right now is the really not sexy stuff. It's the infrastructure about data hosting, cloud computing, software as a service, networks and communication bandwidth that will enable a force to get the shiny, bright widget.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to end on that note. We are out of time. Thank you both for being here today. Thank you to our audience. Coming up next in Habsburg at 4, we have a session called Democracy in the Digital Space, an Alliance for a Healthy Infosphere. And on the Mary Teresa stage, European cooperation with representatives of ministries of defense from Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Sweden. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to my panelists.
Thank you very much, Patrick.